Welcome to Rings and Things, where we discuss Tolkien adaptations and texts. We're just two hobbits from the Shire, one bringing the other along on this adventure. I'm your host, Agnes, and this is my co-host...
Recurring guest star,
JD.
So did you want to just jump right into part 2 of the Fellowship, second half of the Fellowship?
Let's jump right in.
Okay.
So in the second half of the Fellowship, it opens with Aragorn at his mother's grave. Was that something that you understood, that it was his mother's grave when you watched it?
I guess if I thought about it, I would have realized might have been family. I don't know if I would have guessed his mother, though.
Yeah, it's supposed to be his mother's grave. I've always wondered what it must be like to have a full-on statue of one's mother.
So, this is a very early tangent, but in ancient Rome, they used to have a family room. Are you aware of this already?
No, tell me more.
It was an entire room of the house where like wealthier upper-class Romans would go, and it's busts of every patriarch of the family going back for generations. So you could go and see your great-great-great-great-grandfather and what he looked like. It's like something they always did before they died. I think I would have hated that personally.
Well, it makes sense given that Aragorn is royalty that maybe his mom would have a statue made then.
Yeah, I'm just glad I don't have a creepy face room or a literal statue of a dead relative. That seems like a curse wrapped in a blessing.
So then the Fellowship sets out. The first thing that you observed watching the second half was...
It was really fun to see everybody trudging through the snow and Legolas just right on top.
Which is actually from the books.
I believe it.
In the books, it's specified that Legolas walks on the snow, on top of the snow, instead of sinking in, because elves have a different relationship to the natural world than humans do. And one of the effects of this is that they get to walk on top of snow. Legolas doesn't actually wear snow boots. He wears, like, thin cloth shoes kind of thing.
He is straight up flexing on them. I feel like if I were Legolas, I would have been pressured to just not. I don't know if it's an ability that you could turn on and off like that. I'm sure he could trudge through it if he had to. And I would have felt compelled by social convention.
Elves are just that cool.
I'm sure he didn't see it that way. When they're climbing the mountain, there's already like debate about if they're going to climb the mountain or go through the mountain. I think before they even take off, really, it's like the first conflict the Fellowship deals with is it's an decision making. Is that accurate, or is there other stuff along the journey that they're dealing with at this point?
Picking their path in the book is the biggest source of conflict. Even before they go to the mountain, whether they're going to the mountain is the source of conflict. It's there's some very interesting adaptational choices made at this point in the movie, but I'm sure we'll be able to come back and look at exactly what the choices were made when we have all the details of the book.
Oh, I see. Yeah, in the movie it just comes off as it's mostly Gimli just whining that they're not going to the mines.
There's some interesting adaptational choices. We'll evaluate them when we get to the movie. When they're on the mountain in the movie, though, another adaptation choice that's been made is the depiction of Gandalf and Saruman singing back and forth at each other. And I love this adaptation.
Yeah, what's so great about it to you?
Music has a big role in Tolkien's world.
Mm-hmm.
Remember all the poetry?
Yeah.
That's because all of those are really songs. And when we get to the Silmarillion, we'll see how music is at the core of the creation story of the world.
Oh, that's interesting. I like that a lot.
It's one of my favorite creation stories ever. Music is magic, and magic is music in some sense. So the fact that Gandalf and Saruman are singing their magic at each other is, I think, incredibly appropriate.
Yeah, I didn't realize magic had such a deep place in the cosmology. I like that a lot.
Yeah, music is very important. This is why the poems and the songs actually are important in the books, or at least part of the reason. It's the reason that I find most compelling. Mm-hmm. But that's why I like the depiction of Gandalf and Saruman.
This is close to the point where Saruman kind of disables the mountain path, right? Or is this before?
This is while he's doing that.
Yes. Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah. So the option to go over this, is the mountain have a name? I know the mines do.
The mountain is called Karathras.
Karathras. Yes. Okay, I remember that now. So the going over Katharas is not an option. So they go back and find an entrance into the mines that Gimli's ancestors built, or are they just both dwarves, so he feels a kinship?
Gimli's ancestors would have built it.
Okay.
The Longbeards is the family of dwarves that Gimli comes from, and it's the same family of dwarves where Durin comes from. So they are all somehow related.
Got it. And that was just off the dome, because that was not a note I had made.
The first time I watched the movie, I was really proud of myself as a little kid that I realized that the answer to the riddle on the Doors of Moria was to say friend. I wasn't astute enough to realize that it was going to be in Elvish, but I had the riddle cracked, and I was really proud of myself.
Yeah, it's a pretty classic one. Although I wonder if I'm trying to remember back, how much do we know that Elvish have a language? I feel like there's a little bit shown, but it's definitely not ever a central point yet. It seems like background flavor. So this might be, when you're watching the movies the first time, like the different languages really come up as a plot point. As
a plot point, probably, but there have been scenes where like Arwen was talking in Elvish to Aragorn and there were subtitles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think a viewer would be able to recognize that there might be Elvish involved.
Yeah, the clues were there.
Did you realize?
I don't think I would have gotten, I don't know. Again, this might be one of the things I think got spoiled before I even watched the movie for the first time, speak, friend, and enter. I definitely remember hearing that phrase before, but I didn't know the answer, saying friend or in Elvish, so I remember thinking it was pretty clever. Can you remind me how exactly they end up solving it? Is it by accident?
In the movie, Frodo realizes that the answer is friend, and he asks Gandalf what's the Elvish word for friend, and in answering the question, Gandalf opens the doors. Yes,
that's it. So Frodo kind of knew that it needed to be in Elvish, and Gandalf knew the word for Elvish, so the two of their thinking and knowledge bases kind of worked together to solve it.
Correct.
Right, okay.
So after the Fellowship goes into Moria and they discover that it's not a thriving kingdom anymore, eventually they end up in a battle skirmish around Balin's tomb. And this fight is my favorite action sequence in the entire trilogy. It's my favorite battle.
It's pretty good, yeah.
I love this one because it's the only time you have the entire Fellowship fighting together. Yeah,
that's true. After this, well, we'll discuss soon, but after this, there isn't any opportunity.
Exactly. Someone's always missing.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like the camaraderie of all of them fighting together.
Yeah, I didn't even pick up on that. It was a really nice scene, though, and each character does get their own time, and there's a lot of ebb and flow and backing each other up and rescuing each other.
All of that, and it's funny.
Mm-hmm.
You have Sam with his frying pan and stuff like that I find it amusing. I also enjoy that there's always something new that I recognize about this battle.
Oh, really?
Something I didn't pay attention to in my last 100 viewings of it.
Was there one this time?
I think I was too busy making a note about that this was my favorite action sequence to actually pay much attention to the details this time.
Yeah.
So after the fight at Balin's tomb, they run away, and as the Fellowship is fleeing, Gandalf fights a Balrog. He falls down into the depths. Was this something that had been spoiled for you before you watched the movie?
Yes, it has, actually. Unfortunately, Gandalf coming back, was also spoiled for me. And to come back, you have to go.
That makes sense. So this did not come as a surprise to you?
No.
I believe we should have a moment of silence for Gandalf.
Yes, rest in peace.
All right.
One thing I will say after Gandalf's death, and right before it was, this was the one, knowing what comes up with Boromir, this is the one time he got to be an actual hero and earned an anti-hero title. He saved Frodo, Merry, and Pippin many times in the scene where Gandalf's fighting the Balrog.
Boromir's a solid guy.
I wouldn't go that far, but he's a good character.
He has one moment of weakness where he gives into temptation, and then he recovers himself.
That's true.
And gives his life in defense of the hobbits.
Yeah, he. Man, I wish I had prepared for this conversation better. There was something. Well, we talked about it in the last episode. The movie Boromir is different than the book Boromir too. Him acting weird about the sword, I felt like the energy was off in that scene, which was we discussed in the last episode, a big difference, you said, right?
I don't know if I'd describe it as a big difference, but it is a difference, and I think it's significant to the feelings we get about movie Boromir versus book Boromir.
I like an anti-hero though, so I'm kind of trying to defend that title for him. It's one I like that he's got an edge to him, a bit of a disgruntled streak running throughout all of his lines. So they escape from the mines and end up on the top of the mountain. Again, correct? Or not on top of the mountain, but on top of a hilly area.
They end up through the mountain.
Yes. Okay.
And after they exit, they head on to Lothlorien.
Yes, and a note I made at this point, because this watch through was my first watch through. If I were describing you the plot of the Fellowship of the Rings, I would have just completely skimmed over Lothlorien. I've forgotten about it completely.
Why do you think that was?
I have no idea. All I can say is rewatching it, some of the best scenes of the movie were in Lothlorien. I feel like it might just due to the runtime and my short attention span, and this was kind of a lull between two action scenes, maybe. Although I wasn't a kid, so I don't have an excuse. But if I were like, say, an 8-year-old, I could see zoning out at that point.
When I was 11 and I watched this, I had no idea that hobbits had hairy feet. So I was very confused when I saw Frodo's feet walking down the stairs in Lothlorien. I thought that they were just that dirty, and he needed to take a moment to get the muck from his journey off his feet.
No, that's just how they are.
I learned better eventually, but this is also something that you are culturally aware of coming into watching Lord of the Rings. It didn't come as a huge shock to you that hobbits had hairy feet.
No, I had heard the term hobbit feet well before I knew what a hobbit was.
I had never heard of hobbits before, or their feet.
I thought it was just like an expression, like I didn't realize it was related to Lord of the Rings.
So after the Fellowship has had their stay in Lorien and they're leaving, in the extended edition, there's a scene of Galadriel giving gifts to the Fellowship.
Almost all of the Fellowship.
Who did the movie miss?
Boromir gets nothing in the movie.
In the book, he gets a belt.
Oh, yeah, no. He does not get anything. It's not even like reference that he gets nothing. He's just suspiciously missing. It's really funny, actually.
I'd never noticed that. So I'll have to watch that next time I watch through. But, you're right, because I can't think of what he got.
I'm surprised. I didn't know that he got something in the book. I thought it was like a sign.
No, there's some changes made to the gift list, and that's actually what I want to get on my little soapbox and complain about right now. Mm-hmm. If I could change one thing in the entire trilogy, in the entire movie, there's a laundry list of things that are common complaints, but the thing I would change is I would omit Sam's ingratitude for the rope that Galadriel gives him. It's so unlike Sam to be ungrateful for a gift from an elf queen. In the books, rope was exactly what he wanted and needed. He was so happy to get it. And I just think it makes me cringe every time I hear his, "Could I have one of those nice shiny daggers?" That's not the Sam that I came here to watch.
Specifically, he says that you must be out of them, which really does come off as kind of insulting.
I hate that line. It's the one thing I would change. The movie can have every other thing I don't like about it in it. That's the thing I would change. Just omit that one line.
It didn't strike me as that bad. Although I guess if it not being there in the book, it would have been, that seems like a pretty major change. I thought
it's inconsequential toward, in considering the movement of the plot. I just find it incredibly distasteful, and because it's so unnecessary in the movement of the plot, why in the world would you change Sam that way? Don't do that.
all right, I'm not going to die on this proverbial hill, but what if instead of it being a comment on Sam's character, it was showing how graceful the elf queen could take a jest, because she didn't get offended by it. She laughed with it, perhaps, but they didn't have to. They could have done something else to not throw Sam under the bus. I agree.
I'll think about that perspective. I'll have to get back to you on that.
Yeah, it's a generous read. I'm grasping at straws here, but I'm just trying to consider both sides of why they would include that.
No, that's fair. I need to think about it.
So I didn't take any notes on it, but there was one scene that did stick out to me, and it was another. This would be the second time, I believe, that Frodo tries to pawn off the ring on somebody else to take and guard. Man, do you want to tell me this elf queen's name before I keep calling her that?
Galadriel.
So Galadriel, he tries to offer it to her, and she seems like, of the three people he offers it to, the one who kind of came the closest to accepting it. But she did come up off right at the bat. She'd say, like, instead of a dark lord, you'd have a dark queen, which is a very good line. And she kind of shows how dangerous and powerful she could be. That was a great scene. I loved that. I felt really bad for Frodo at that point, because you could see the trust he had kind of just like it felt like a plate of food slopping onto the floor, sliding off sadly. But she rejects his offer, and the plot continues, thankfully.
And so I think you were leading up to asking something about, you were saying of the three people he offers the ring to. Mm-hmm. Was there something you were asking about that?
I feel like Galadriel was the most likely to accept it, because the other two were Gandalf and Aragorn. They were very adamant on not taking it. She, I don't know, played with the idea more, but that just might be her rhetoric style as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if that read is very accurate or not, but that's what I got from my initial impression.
She definitely wanted it the most of the three of them. How close she was to taking it is a good question. In
my read, from the way that this adaptation is directed, it feels like every time he offers it up, with maybe the exception of the last one that's upcoming, like Gandalf also felt like he was this close to just doing it. But he didn't. And I know he, like, in his character too, that's not very likely, but the temptation you could hear is palpable in his voice. And that's just that might be, again, just acting versus actual character essence or points, but in these two scenes, it shows like the two different reactions that he could get from trying to get rid of this, and it's helping hammer home, like, Frodo, you gotta keep this ring from anybody.
And he's got to do that because the ring ultimately corrupts people that it's around, even members of the Fellowship. Yes.
So one thing, so we're leading up into Boromir's corruption. And I did write in my note is because in this upcoming scene, Boromir catches Frodo alone and attempts to take the ring. It seems like it's just at first a conversation, and then he gets physical. He tries to grab it. Frodo is forced to use the ring's power to hide from Boromir, which of course is not a great turn of events. Although I'm not saying it was it might have been his only choice. I felt for Boromir because the corrupting influence of the ring really makes it like, how much can you judge somebody if there's an outside influence acting on their personality and decision making? Like, at that point, and it's also not something he's like consciously doing, it's happening to him. So how much is Boromir's corruption just the ring influence, or is that part of him like that? Is there something that makes him uniquely susceptible?
The answer to all your questions is yes. The ring is acting on him. It is extra potent with him because of who he is. He desires the power to defend his country and to defeat his enemy in open warfare. and the ring will have an easier time worming its way into your mind, into your desires, when you have desires for power. That's why a Baggins is the best holder of the ring, because Bagginses don't want any power. The people you want to give power to are those who don't want power. As soon as someone steps forward and says, please give me power, vote for me, whatever tagline you want to put on it, that is the biggest sign that that person is not fit for power.
Right, yes, definitely.
In the medieval church, they would only ordain people to bishop, supposedly, who would at least say that they didn't want to be bishop.
I imagine that eventually, that's an interesting, I imagine that started genuine. I feel like eventually it probably was a formality, part of the ritual of becoming one, and you just say it. But this kind of reminds me, in certain cultures, you have to be polite. If you're offered a gift, reject it like 1 or 2 times before accepting it, because otherwise you seem like you're being greedy or uncouth.
But getting back to what we were talking about initially, Boromir desires this power. It is his desire for power that makes him extra susceptible to the external powers that are working upon him. So feeling bad for him is, I think, entirely valid. Mm-hmm. And acknowledging that there is an element that he also controlled here is also valid. It's not an either or, it's a both and.
This theme probably goes throughout the whole movie from what I remember. Boromir might not have tried anything at that moment if Gandalf were still around. I feel like he knew he couldn't try anything with Gandalf around out of fear.
Things would have been really different on many fronts if Gandalf were still around.
Yeah, that's very true.
And if Gandalf were still around, he wouldn't be becoming Gandalf the White, and if he wasn't becoming Gandalf the White, he wouldn't have the authority to deal with Saruman, and so everything worked out.
It was all part of fate.
It was almost like this was how it was meant to be.
Huh.
Boromir's corruption here serves as an instrument of fate.
Right. As I think everybody in this series is. They're all on a path that they didn't put themselves there, and kind of got forced into the roles they play. Although I don't know how much you could say that about the true evils like Sauron and Saruman, but maybe that's something we could touch on at some point.
Absolutely. I would say that specifically who they are, how they got there, are things they chose. The evils they commit end up being turned to ultimately greater ends. They're defeated. Similarly to how Boromir, in his small way, he made a choice to, about his ends and means. The corruption was not in what he wanted. The corruption was how he was willing to get there. And he did a bad thing trying to take the ring from Frodo. But doing that bad thing facilitated Frodo leaving the Fellowship, and a lot of good came out of it. This doesn't justify his bad actions, but good came from them. They were meant to be.
No, but what really softens my heart, and again, doesn't justify, but really throws all of that's when watching this play out, the ring's corrupting influence and how much it is affecting him. He almost immediately turns back, like it's just a quick lapse in judgment, and he immediately regrets it very deeply.
Which I think speaks volumes to the strength of his character.
He's my boy.
I said Boromir was a solid guy.
Yeah, I agree.
There isn't another example that I can think of, off the top of my head, of anyone who falls prey to the ring and then recovers.
I got a quick one from this very movie, and it might have been in part 1. But Bilbo tries to take the ring from Frodo for a brief moment in
Scary Bilbo.
Yeah, scary Bilbo.
In the book, he does not.
Ah, okay. I feel like it was almost foreshadowing in the movie with how Bilbo acts there and then Boromir later.
In the book, Frodo has something of a vision where he sees Bilbo become scary Bilbo.
Mm.
But Bilbo doesn't do anything. That's the ring working on Frodo, not the ring working on Bilbo.
Got it. That might also add to the dreamlike sequence if in the books it was literally like part of that conversation and what was happening in that scene was a vision in the book, the source that the movie was coming from.
The scene in the book happens about the same in the movie, that it's Frodo and Bilbo alone-ish.
Yeah. And so at this point, Frodo had to use the ring to escape Boromir, which allows Sauron to know where he is, and soon a horde is descending upon them.
In the movie, Sauron seems to have a little bit of a GPS on the ring. Mm-hmm. Not so much in the books.
Oh, really?
But even in the books, Sauron gets a little bit of a sense of where something might be because of where Frodo is sitting. Frodo is sitting on that big stone seat, and then he falls off eventually. That seat has some sort of ancient power about it. It allows the person sitting there to see far, and to physically see off.
Yeah.
In the distance, and when Frodo is sitting there with the ring on him, Sauron is in that particular instance able to sense him in the book, but it's not because of the ring, it's because of the seat.
Oh, I see. It's I hadn't realized that at all either. In the movie, it definitely, I think it's even said that using the ring can help him find you, like explicitly by Gandalf before they even leave the Shire.
It's definitely a component in how the movie has chosen to depict it.
Yeah. Merry and Pippin get separated from the rest of the group, and this is when the Fellowship breaks down for real. Because even if Boromir just was corrupted and was gone, I wouldn't really call the Fellowship broken, just Boromir fell out from it. But at this point, and Frodo goes off by himself. Before this, he does once again a third time offer the ring up to Aragorn, he's very gracious and rejects it very plainly. I think you see maybe a wince real quick, like he does still kind of want to grab it, but it's not at all like the other two where it's like he doesn't seem shaken to his core, but he's he's a bit more of a rough and tumble guy, used to dealing with unpleasant experiences than the other two. I feel like plays into it.
Ultimately, movie Aragorn really doesn't want power. He has this hesitant, reluctant character arc about him in the movie. And I think one of the reasons that exists is to try to help with the cognitive dissonance that might exist in movie format if he were as confident about desiring his kingship as he is in the book.
I see.
Given the themes of not wanting power that are also present in the movie.
Yeah, that I do see how that could cause some dissonance in the themes for sure. And so, as the rest, Gimli, Legolas, and Aragorn go to save the other two hobbits, Sam almost misses Frodo. Frodo tries to leave without him, and Sam risks his life trying to get to him on the boat, which, after our discussion about how dangerous water is to hobbits, even if not, because of their societies standing on water, that was like walking, like again, like into like a lava pit almost. It was seen as instant and sure death.
Especially for Sam, yes.
And that is about, I mean, there is a bit more about them continuing on their journey.
They just basically set off, and then the movie closes. Roll credits.
Yeah. Yeah, the movie closes, and you really are itching to watch the Two Towers.
But before we watch the Two Towers, we have some things for you. let's start off talking about what our favorite quotes were from this segment. JD, can you tell us about some of your favorite quotes?
Are we supposed to start with our favorite first? This time, I remember last time it caused a bit of a stir. Are we doing favorite first or second favorite and saving the best for last?
I would say start with your favorite and let's do second favorite next.
Okay, all right. So my absolute favorite, and it's definitely, I could see it being a lot of other people's, is Gandalf talking to Bilbo in the mines about dealing out death in terms to Gollum, and how even though the wisest know not how that ends. That quote really is, it's when the movie reaches out from the screen and starts to hammer points in home that you could take into the real world.
That is one of the best quotes in the entire trilogy, of course. It's a classic, and if you didn't select it, I would have had to.
Yes. Yeah. Did you have a favorite outside of that one?
I actually really like Boromir's quote after they're getting out of the mines, and Aragorn wants everybody to move on, and Boromir says, "Give them a moment for pity's sake."
That one is that one was on my list as well. It's very touching. It's a surprise. You'd expect if they switched those lines to the opposite character, where Boromir's like, "Come on, let's go," and Aragorn, that would have fit the stereotype and the idea in your head. It wouldn't have been as touching coming from, but they made Boromir feel for their loss, not the quote unquote good guy. Although Aragorn is a good guy.
Aragorn is feeling the pressures of leadership.
Yes.
And Boromir has been broing out with the hobbits, and the hobbits have really taken the loss pretty hard. And I just really like the tender side it gives to Boromir's character when he says that.
Yeah, it definitely rounds him out. Like, if it wasn't for that one line, I feel like I would be a lot less sure on your analysis of him. I think I would be calling him just a complete edgelord. He's an anti-hero, but I don't know. This one really rounds out his character and gives him a lot of conflicting sides. So that would leave one more quote for me, and I will be careful to only select one. The one ending out the movie, and I'm sorry to steal it from you, I think, but just Sam, I'm glad you're with me. It's very, very touching at the point, because you see how intent Frodo is on going alone for a minute there, and Sam kind of forces his hand to bring him with him. It's that or let him die. But in the end, he ends up being happy with it.
Every Frodo needs a Sam.
Yes.
And every podcast needs a trivia section. So we're going to bring you some questions about the Lord of the Rings movies. I'm going to read off the questions, and we'll give you the answers next time at the beginning of the podcast. So the first question: why did Sean Bean choose to hike up the mountain to film the scenes for Caradhras? So when they were filming the mountain scene, Sean Bean would get up super early, put on his costume, and hike up the mountain to the filming site.
Oh, wow.
Why did he choose to do it that way?
That's a good one.
Number 2, how many films was Orlando Bloom in before being cast as Legolas? And number 3, what item did Viggo Mortensen take with him everywhere in New Zealand to help him act the part of Aragorn?
Oh man, I can't. I'm gonna read the answer for that one right away. I can't wait to find that one out.
Well, obviously there's 2 weeks for our audience to find out the answers if they care to. Feel free to write in your answers if you want, and I will bring you the answers to these questions, like I said at the beginning of the episode, next time.
And I'll shout out anybody who gets it right.
Sure. So, our next segment is language, lore, and letters. For this segment, I want to talk about an essay that Tolkien wrote. It's called On Fairy Stories. On Fairy Stories is the essay derived from his presentation that he gave in 1939 at the University of St. Andrews.
Yeah, and when I was reading this, I hadn't read the author, so I thought it was just a good presentation about fairy stories, which I thought was pretty funny. I was at least halfway through before I was like looked at and saw who the author was. Like, it was a little surprise Tolkien for me.
Well, this essay is what I would describe as Tolkien's manifesto. This is my favorite non-legendarium work that he wrote. So, basically something that wasn't about Middle-earth, this is my go-to of what he wrote. There's a lot that he builds up in this essay. There's a lot of vocabulary that I want to be using as we continue to talk about not just the movies, but as we get into the books, especially. I want to talk about the vocabulary that he builds here.
Got it.
Fun fact, it's actually in this essay that Tolkien reclaims what used to be a pejorative term, fantasy, and gives it its modern sense. He justifies fantasy for adults and develops the idea of subcreation. Subcreation might also be called world building today. Yeah,
that's a lot of what I watch and enjoy is because of the world building. And I before watching his films, knew Tolkien kind of pioneered modern world building as an idea where you make a work of fiction with an entire, like, not only like talking about the geopolitics, but like magic systems, cosmologies, stuff like that. It was not very common at all. He was a very early adopter and inspired a lot of works that I enjoyed with that.
Yeah, and like I said, Tolkien didn't use the phrase world building, but he called it subcreation. But I feel like they're basically the same concept,
more or less equivalent. Yeah.
So if you hear me throwing around the term subcreation, know that it's approximately equivalent to world building. Fairy is something he talks about a lot in an essay called On Fairy Stories.
Surprisingly.
Fairy is what he calls an alternate dimension. Those are my words, alternate dimension, where all fantasy creatures live. And it is Tolkien that we have to thank for why we have any conception of elves as tall, beautiful, graceful, perilous, and intimidating creatures. Tolkien was fighting against the diminutive fairy stereotype, like Tinkerbell.
Well, also, when you're talking about small elves, like Santa's workshops, or...
That's another great example.
The Keebler elves?
Sure, yeah. All great examples of the Victorian diminutive elves. And Tolkien really supplanted that with his conception of elves that you see in media today.
Yeah. He he didn't invent, but he brought back up the idea of what we hear as an elf, and he interpreted it a bit. He kind of took a lot of different sources and synergized them into one coherent idea.
Yeah. Now, men can go to fairy by enchantment. Like men the race can go to fairy by something called enchantment. Enchantment is that magic by which elves create art so real that it is indistinguishable from what we perceive as reality.
Got it. So that goes back to the singing magic.
Exactly. Singing magic that is so real that it creates reality is creation. What Tolkien does in his world is subcreation.
Oh, I see. So that's why subcreation as a term is pretty important then.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Enchantment is creation. What humans do is subcreation. Subcreation is that magic by which we create art as close as we can to enchantment. So the better the subcreation is, the closer it is to enchantment.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And you hear people talk about art that way, where they tell you they read a book and they felt like they were really there.
Which would be an indication of how close that subcreation came to enchantment. Arguably, I would say that Middle-earth is one of the most enchanting subcreations that exists.
Yeah, no, it's a pretty easy pick. You'd be hard pressed to find somewhere or any other creation that comes very close. I'm not saying there isn't any, but it wouldn't surprise me if that was the most commonly picked, most magical created world.
Well, maybe when we look at other stories, we can look at how good is the subcreation in non-Middle-earth works in general and see how close to enchantment other works come.
I'll reserve my my final pick for which comes the closest or even may surpass Middle-earth, but it's a tough contest. There are some good worlds out there.
The next big term that Tolkien dives into is the difference between primary and secondary belief. Primary belief is our belief in the real world. My belief that you are real, JD. Your belief that I am real and that the podcast we are recording together is real. That's primary belief. Secondary belief is our belief in an enchanted or subcreated world. This is different from a suspension of disbelief. At this point in the essay, Tolkien proposes that if one must suspend disbelief, then the subcreation or enchantment has fundamentally failed in that instance. If the world that has been built or subcreated requires you to step outside it and say, I need to suspend my disbelief, the rules here are inconsistent, something has gone wrong in the art, and that is a failing of the art.
So is secondary belief commenting on how internally consistent these systems are?
There would be a relation, yes.
Okay.
It's all right to have fantastical things that wouldn't happen in the real world happen in your story. That should not cause your audience to suspend disbelief. Mm-hmm. But it should be internally consistent in your world.
Right, yeah. So you can't one day have a magic system that magic is extremely rare and mystical, and then the next day go to a different city where they're using it to using fire magic as lighters from their fingertips. It wouldn't make a lot of sense.
You could, but you'd need a good explanation for it.
Fair enough.
And Tolkien tends to have a soft magic system, is what it's called,
mm-hmm.
where he doesn't go into explaining the mechanics behind precisely how magic works, and that's also fine. This is a world where soft magic happens, but then it's all soft magic.
Yes.
There isn't a definite answer for the rings, but not for Gandalf's magic.
Yes, and then it would be very weird to figure out Gandalf went to a school to learn his magic. It wouldn't feel right.
Precisely. That would cause a suspension of disbelief.
Yes. Yeah, it would not feel right at all. And I will say real quick that soft magic is underrated in modern fantasy. I love it. Quick tangent, but you can continue.
In general, Tolkien was very skeptical of visual adaptations of fantasy. He thought it required too much suspension of disbelief inherently. Perhaps some of this can be accounted for with updated graphics. I mean, he was writing this presentation in 1939. They didn't have CGI back then.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel that there is a dimension to this opinion that is actually true.
Definitely. I do have a quick question here. Is he talking about maybe like plays more than anything then? Because movies weren't, and film wasn't a big thing in they were around, but they weren't like on the level of books in the 30s.
He was largely talking about theater, and animation was starting to come around. The Hobbit was released the same year as Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So I imagine that Tolkien could have conceived of an animated fantasy work at this point, but live action films, I'm not sure how common fantasy adaptations at that point were, seeing as, he was reclaiming the concept of fantasy for adults at this point as well.
Yes.
But he was very skeptical of adaptations, and Tolkien has some very good letters about adaptation that I'm sure we'll find some time to look at a few of the big ones at some point later in later segments here.
I think the important thing is, even with updated CGI, that because animation was a thing, like you said, and beautiful animation, but your own personal interpretation of what magic looked like and what the fantasy is in your head will never, it's hard to capture that unless you're an artist creating art, trying to capture this image. And then that's just a visual adaptation for you for what true fantasy is, and it might speak to some people on some level, but I think that's what he was getting at, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah. And books can be appropriately vague at certain times.
It's like the idea in horror that if you show an empty doorway, it's scarier than the scariest monster you could draw or create with CGI.
I can see the analogy here. I was going to say that you can make a battle scene in a book very vague and overview, but how do you make a vague and overview battle sequence in a movie? Yeah,
no, you have, only through dialogue, which is kind of getting at the same tool and idea.
Show, don't tell.
Yeah.
So visual adaptations of fantasy have limitations. In The Hobbit, when Bilbo is picking up the ring, it's described as being entirely black, as he's inner monologuing to himself, finding the ring. Imagine how boring that scene would be on TV.
Yeah.
3 minutes of an entirely black screen.
Yeah, that wouldn't be too great.
So there are certainly limitations to visual media for fantasy, and I just think it's interesting that Tolkien gives, its own section to visual adaptations of fantasy, considering that we're talking about visual adaptations of fantasy. Tolkien moves on to talking about the purposes of fantasy. He identifies the purposes of fantasy as being recovery, escape, and consolation. He defines recovery as regaining a clear view of things as we were meant to see them. So an example of this might be Treebeard, would be an example of recovering our respect for trees.
Okay.
As living beings.
Right. So it's this is kind of getting into like why we even tell stories in a way. It's very abstract.
It is kind of abstract, but specifically Tolkien, disagree with Tolkien if you want, but he specifically says that a fantasy story should have the property of recovery.
Right.
And a fantasy story should have the property of escape, which the quote I like about escape that he has in there is, those who would criticize fantasy's escapist nature, quote, confound the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter.
And so it's saying, okay, hold on. Do you want to go on? What do you think that means? Because I am processing it still.
So what Tolkien is trying to say here is that fantasy should be escapist, first of all.
Yes.
And when people criticize fantasy for being escapist, it's because they are saying that you can't apply fantasy to the real world.
Mm-hmm.
The escape of the prisoner is something that we would understand. Like, if you're a prisoner, you're going to want to escape.
Yeah.
Personally, I think Tolkien was probably more thinking of POWs rather than criminals.
Right.
In this context, when he speaks of the escape of the prisoner. But who would blame a POW for trying to escape, really?
Yeah. I mean, there are certain countries, like modern countries, that don't carry in extending prison sentences for escape attempts because they feel it's so natural for a human to do that when confined.
Which is extremely relevant here, that the escape of the prisoner is something that is natural and laudable even, and fundamentally not a problem. The flight of the deserter would be an act of cowardice.
Yeah, it's leaving people you're supposed to care about to be hurt.
And Tolkien is saying that the escapist quality of fantasy is the escape of the prisoner, not the flight of the deserter. There's nothing dishonorable about the escapism that should be in a fairy story, should be in a fantasy.
So in that sentence, is he kind of saying it's because it's not hurting anybody? Your escape, your flight of fancy, so to speak, isn't leaving other people without your support.
But it's also natural and something that we should be doing as POWs in the real world.
Got it. So the comparison works both ways on both sides. It's almost like this guy should have been an author.
Yeah, it's almost like he fought in a war.
Yeah, that too.
And then the third aspect, the third purpose of fantasy is consolation. He defines it as the joy of the happy ending. I will call it eucatastrophe. Eucatastrophe is a, quote, sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to return. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal defeat. So, ultimately, a fantasy story should be hopeful.
Yeah.
It should leave you feeling better about the world, not worse from it.
Quick question. Why did he go with, did he coin eucatastrophe, right? Or did he dredge it up from some old book?
He coined the word eucatastrophe. It comes from the Greek prefix eu, meaning good, EU.
Mm-hmm.
And then catastrophe, meaning a negative turn of events. Instead, this is a good turn of events.
So functionally, though, he could have used just a traditional word like miracle, but...
Miracle has too much baggage with it.
Yeah, I could see that.
He wanted to make a term that didn't have the baggage that comes along with things like that.
But functionally, the way people will colloquially use miracle to describe an event, a turn of events that shouldn't have happened, and just it's basically the same idea.
Same idea, and possibly even with a similar divine intervention involved. Except I would say my impression is that eucatastrophe can be more passively divinely intervening, whereas miracles carry a very active divine intervention connotation with them.
Tolkien might have been a little bit afraid to step on the Catholic Church toes.
I wasn't going to talk about it, but he actually does have a section at the end of the essay where he talks about his faith. Tolkien is a very privately Catholic man.
Yes.
He was absolutely Catholic, very faithful, but it was not his business to try to be evangelical the way like his friend C.S. Lewis was.
Yeah.
So the end of On Fairy Stories is actually one of the only places where he actually openly talks about his religion.
In like his writings at all?
Ever.
That's pretty impressive.
There's passing references in some of his letters, and it's certainly not the only place, but it is one of the only places, and it was his most public place.
Got it. So that's what eucatastrophe was. Was there more to it?
That was about it that I had for
defining the term
for eucatastrophe, but I have one last point on the essay.
Right.
So, one of the big themes that is present in Tolkien's writings that he talks about in this essay is that he ascribes to the medieval outlook that the world is diminishing and regressing, as opposed to becoming bigger, better, greater, and progressing. We can see these themes in his works through things like the elves fading and industrialization. Makes the world a poorer place.
Yeah, certainly in Lord of the Rings, that's for sure.
Tolkien would argue that industrialization in our world makes the world a poorer place.
Well, yeah, and I'm not arguing that, right? Especially not right now. There's a lot to say about that, and I'm not disagreeing, is all I'm going to say right now.
Well, agree or disagree with Tolkien how you want, but this is what I mean when I say that the essay is a manifesto. He defines all of these terms, he gets all of these concepts going, he reclaims vocabulary, he's got an agenda, it's, like I said, the only place that he so publicly talks about his faith. He has this medieval outlook about diminishing, regressing, and industrialization, which, might not be popular with everyone, especially 100 years ago. And it's a great essay. We'll have the link to an essay, to a copy of the essay in the description if you care to give the essay a read, because this was only a summary.
Yes. Yeah. And I will say one passing moment. I've been itching to say it since the beginning. He's very sassy. He is throwing a lot of different people under the bus.
I think it's a great read.
Yeah, he has a lot of ideas on how people talk about these terms, and back then it was basically only like they'd only use fairy tale in the sense of a big like a lie, the colloquial sense where somebody would say, oh, she's out telling fairy stories about this event, or fantasy was it was only used as an insult to say books were too far, and now it's a very neutral descriptor, it could good or bad. I think this essay definitely did a lot of heavy lifting to allow a lot of people to be creative and enjoy these creative works.
It absolutely did. This was a very important milestone in the development of the entire fantasy genre. The fact that we can say the word fantasy in a non-pejorative way, the fact that adults can enjoy this. We have this essay, this presentation to thank for that, which is why I wanted to take such a long look at it.
Yeah.
Because it is such a monumental work with so much vocabulary that I'm going to be using from here on out.
Got it. And I will try to comprehend it. Well, hey, I might even use it a few times.
We can always redefine the terms, but this is where I'm getting them from the essay he wrote himself. So JD, we have questions that need answering.
Ooh.
We have a question from Stephen J. He says, music plays such an important role in Lord of the Rings. Getting the right composer for the movie must have been tough. Do you have a favorite song? Have you ever wondered how the tone of the movies might have been different had PJ gone with John Williams or Hans Zimmer?
So, I will admit, I do not have a favorite song, and I didn't even take the time to select it. So we'll just get that right on the table. I didn't look through I like listening to the music. The soundtrack's very great, but I did not listen through and pick a favorite song, no.
My favorite song is The Breaking of the Fellowship. It's the song that plays throughout the last sequence. It's quite a long one.
I do remember the instrumentals being quite moving at that part, yes.
Absolutely my favorite song. Not just my favorite song in the trilogy, it's just my favorite song.
Just your favorite song, wow. I was wondering if it was your favorite song in the movie we were discussing, it was just your favorite Fellowship of the Ring song or Lord of the Rings generally song, but it's just your favorite song in the world.
It's certainly up there. That particular song inspired me to try to learn violin.
I'm going to listen to it on the drive home.
Now, JD, I need to ask you a question about this.
Right.
When someone refers to the music of the Lord of the Rings, is there one particular song that you think of?
No. It's kind of all a blur, I'm sad to say.
Now, when someone says Star Wars or Pirates of the Caribbean, is there one particular song you think of?
Well, yes. At least there's one that comes to mind first for both.
Which is how I experience it as well. I wanted to know if you had the same experience with this as I did.
Mm-hmm. And I'm a bit of a Star Wars nerd, so I know there's actually two kind of when you get to Star Wars. There's the intro theme and then the Force theme. Both of those are very beautiful pieces, but when you say Star Wars music, the first thing that comes to mind is that big, heavy intro theme music to start for me, at least.
So, when the question says, have you ever wondered how the tone of the movies might be different if they'd gone with John Williams or Hans Zimmer? The thing that I think of is that Lord of the Rings might have a much more recognizable one piece of music type theme.
I don't know if I would have liked that, though.
I don't think I would have liked it either, but I think that might be how it would have been different.
So another thing about John Williams is I feel like all of his soundtracks sound the same. They're good, but there's a very distinctive John Williams funk on them. And
I don't even know what else Howard Shore has composed.
Yeah, I'm not.
Lord of the Rings is the only thing I know that he's composed.
Yeah.
So I can't really compare on that front, but... I know with Star Wars, I think of the Imperial March, and with Pirates of the Caribbean, I think he's a pirate.
Yeah, it's funny you say Imperial March, which is a very classic one, and yes, drums to mind. But we do have 3 different answers for our classic Star Wars song, but I gave 2. So you asked me you asked me a question, I'm probably going to give you 2 answers, though.
Well, it was just a thought I had that...
John Williams, just real quick, did the music for Indiana Jones as well, and a lot of other things.
I know he's prolific, yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like every time it just sounds like Star Wars to me. So...
Which is also a valid answer to the question.
So I would be worried if John Williams did Lord of the Rings. I'd have been just like, this is fantasy Star Wars. And I'm kind of glad it's not, because that would have been a weird vibe.
Well, I would argue that Star Wars is fantasy, but
Yeah.
we can argue about that when we get to the Star Wars section of the podcast one day, maybe.
That is a fair point. At least according to this essay, I could definitely see your point. It doesn't say anything about, being about in a forest with elves and magic for the definition of a fantasy.
I mean, they go to forest planets, and there's things
That
that
is
live
true.
in the forest that have special powers. Just saying.
That is true, yes.
Well, anyway, I think that brings us to the end of the podcast. You can follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram through the links in the description. Please follow, like, and subscribe on Spotify and YouTube. To have your question or comment featured on the podcast, please send an email to shirepost.ringsandthings@gmail.com.
And a special thank you to our editor and spiritual producer, Stephen Jeffrey. And thank you for listening.